Welcome everyone to the webinar today, Recruiting and Retention in Today's Environment. I'm Pat Soldano. I'm president of Family Enterprise USA. We represent and advocate for generationally owned family businesses and their lifetimes of savings in Washington, D.C., all sizes of business and all industries of business. So today in this webcast, we're going to discuss the latest trends in family office and family business recruiting, retention, including things like recruiting and retaining that top talent in a competitive market that we're in today, managing independent contractors, next generation leaders, non-compete agreements, retirement issues. We will have a Q&A session at the end. This webcast is being conducted in a Q&A format. There is a chat room, as everyone knows, and a Q&A. You're welcome to put your questions in either of those, and I will attempt to monitor those as we go through. Some of you sent questions as you registered. We appreciate that. Thank you so much. We have those. We will attempt to get to those at the end. We do have a lot of information to cover, and we have a lot of questions. So I want to get started right away with introducing our panelists. I'm here with my friend and sponsor of FEUSA, Linda Mack, and Linda Mack is founder of Mac International LLC, a premier executive search and strategic consulting firm. From its start 20 years ago this year, Linda's business has been focused on single-family offices, multi-client family offices, and family enterprises. Mac International specializes in providing C-suite executive search and strategic consulting solutions to family offices, family investment firms, and family business enterprises. Welcome, Linda.
Yep.
In addition, I am joined by Laura Lawless. She is a partner in the labor and employment practice at Squire Patton Boggs, which is a global firm with over 1,500 offices, 1,500 lawyers, practicing in 40 offices in 4 continents. Laura collaborates with human resource professionals, business owners, and general counsel to address employee-related compliance and litigation.
Thank you.
Welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
Also joining us today is Preston Rutledge. He is the strategic consulting advisor for the Washington, D.C. office of Brownstein Law Firm. Preston is a former assistant secretary of labor for employee benefits, security administration. Whereas the nation's top pension regulator, he oversaw an agency of over 830 employee benefit professionals in Washington, D.C., and in 13 regional offices throughout the United States. So welcome all. Really appreciate you joining us for this webcast today. So Linda, let's get started right with you. Let's start with some of the challenges that you see in recruiting today. It seems that in this world that we finally got the pandemic behind us, we now face a different kind of landscape for hiring and retaining some of our employees. Some of the issues are directly related to the fallout from the pandemic, but there are other challenges as well, and you know about those. Can you share with us your observation of those challenges? And maybe in doing that, you can give us your top pick, maybe your top 3 challenges facing family businesses, family offices in recruiting.
Great. Thanks, Pat. I'd say that in terms of the overall landscape out there, post-pandemic, it has become ever increasingly competitive. We hear families, particularly for accounting positions and some others, just tearing their hair out in terms of being able to successfully identify and recruit people. Very, very competitive out there. That's number 1. Number 2, I think that this hybrid remote work environment has been a huge challenge and an ever growing challenge for families out there, whether it's family office or family business. And I think it's not just the pressure on overall recruiting and retaining if you're not on that scale, but it's also things like culture. How do you successfully build a culture in your family business or family office that highly depends on building personal relationships, trust, and collaboration when you're working in a remote environment? How do you provide the training and mentoring that particularly younger staff need when you're operating in a remote hybrid environment? So those are some key challenges that we see coming out that are ever increasing. I'd say A challenge that is not new, but is ever present with families is hiring someone who not only brings the requisite skills to be successful in the position, but is also the right culture fit. Because if the culture fit is not right, it's never going to work out no matter how talented the person. And that continues to be a big challenge for families, their family offices, their family businesses. And I'd add one more that is more recent is inflation and higher interest rates, particularly on mortgages. Inflation is creating compression and a lot of challenges around compensation, and the higher mortgage interest rates is really creating big challenges for any family or family business that needs to relocate somebody. And they may be sitting on a 2% mortgage, and the mortgage for a new place is considerably higher than that. So I'd say that's a handful of the key challenges that we're seeing in the market today.
Well, that's very helpful. So let's talk about family business and specifically for a minute. I know you come from a family business. You are a family business. What kind of changes do you think that family businesses and family offices need to make in this changing environment? That is to keep their employees happy. Is it money? Is it benefits? Is it something else?
I think, certainly market competitive compensation is always important. But having said that, there are a lot of other key things these days. I mentioned culture before. We look at it as every employee has a choice each day. Do they continue to work for the company they're with or the family office they're with, or do they want to seek something else? So building and maintaining a culture that people choose to want to be part of is really, really important. And again, as I mentioned before, in a hybrid environment, it's that much more challenging to do, but it's critically important. We hear over and over, and I'm sure you do, work-life balance. How do family businesses, I think they've got an advantage over big corporates in this case, because I think they're just a lot more in touch with their employees personally, and can create the family culture as part of the environment. But I think being very sensitive to that work-life balance that people are seeking today is really, really important. I think leadership, flexibility, and adaptability, it's a rapidly changing and evolving world out there, and the leadership needs to be communicating effectively and needs to be very flexible and adaptable to where employees are and what is needed to be able to keep them highly performing and belonging, so to speak, feeling a sense of belonging to the family business. And certainly last but not least, and this is ongoing and has been for all time, opportunities for growth and development, not just financial growth, but personal and professional growth and development, and being able to consistently provide that to their employees. I also hear that food is very important too, particularly coming out of the pandemic, providing food and social activities to create more of the bonding, and the relationships between people are also important.
I've seen that in a lot of corporate offices, the food. So since you mentioned it, I'm going to go off script a little bit here and talk about work-life balance, because one of our registrants actually asked this question. What are the changes to benefits and work-life balance leadership and executives are looking for today that they weren't looking for 5 years ago?
I think that it is, some of it goes hand in hand with this hybrid environment. People looking for more flexibility to be with their families or family events type of thing. I think at the workplace, we see a lot more physical fitness kinds of activities being provided as a benefit and something on site. You see some of these companies providing, dry cleaning and things like that, or exercise classes, or building a gym or something, but things that are going to entice people to come to the office and also provide a healthier and a more balanced work-life relationship. But as I say, some of the things we're seeing more of too, and that's part of the hybrid, is more flexibility around people wanting to attend family events or children's kinds of activities.
Yes, so I'm going to switch gears and go to Laura now and talk about independent contractor status, because that's always an issue. So Laura, what are the current tests used to determine whether a hired party is an employee or an independent contractor, and what's the significance of each, and how is this relevant to family offices, family businesses? I mean, I don't think they're that different from other businesses, but maybe you can speak to that, and just generally on the independent contractor issue. And Preston, I think if you want to weigh in as well, you're welcome to do that.
Thank you. And let me take the latter part of your question first, which is why is this relevant? And I think this is stemming from some of the points Linda just made in the difficult market that it is to recruit. And especially where in family businesses, there's a reluctance to look outside the family for key personnel. It may be tempting for a business to hire a worker on what they might think of as a probationary basis to see if they fit with the company culture, if they fit with the family's values and direction for the business. And so retain an individual to fill an executive role or a senior role and call them a 1099 independent contractor. Sometimes we even hear these referred to as a 1099 employee, which is not a thing. It's just not a legal concept that makes sense. A contractor is a contractor, an employee is an employee. And it's a very common practice. In fact, there's some data from the National Employment Law Project that says that as many as 30% of workers in this country who are designated as independent contractors are misclassified. And the risks are very, very substantial if you have somebody who should be treated as an employee from day one, and they're being treated as an independent contractor. The thought behind it is there's lots of flexibility. The individual is really treated more like a temporary worker. We're not going through the trouble of adding them to payroll and going through all of that withholding and difficulty on tax payment. We're not tracking their time. And if it doesn't work out, we end the relationship. Well, you can end a relationship with an employee just as well, but by having somebody potentially misclassified as an independent contractor, there's a whole host. I mean, we couldn't go through all of the issues that can stem from misclassification, but they include unpaid overtime claims, lack of benefits that would have been provided to a similarly situated worker who was properly classified, tax consequences, failure to cover workers' compensation for workplace injuries and illnesses, and the list goes on and on. Where it's especially dangerous in the family office business is that if these executives are very high wage or fee earning contractors and they are deemed to have been misclassified, then that annual fee or weekly fee is going to be broken down into what should have been an hourly rate of pay. And if they've been working overtime, which, I mean, who works a 40-hour week anymore? And even if we wanted to, most of them haven't been tracking their time because they've been misclassified. That then gets translated into an overtime exposure, and at time and a half times a very high hourly rate, you can imagine the devastating financial consequences just from the wage and hour exposure alone for misclassification.
Well, so what are some of the steps that employees can take to make sure that they're doing this right and that they improve the likelihood of creating either a bona fide employee or a bona fide independent contractor? And can executives be independent contractors?
They can. So this is not to say that there's no scenario in which an individual can be an independent contractor. The concept still exists, of course, but they have to be, as the name sounds, independent, which means that you would expect them to be providing services to a variety of clients simultaneously or in short order. So somebody may come in as a consultant, perform a month or 2 months worth of work for you. They're then free to go on to their next client and they don't have any conflict of interest in doing so. That's a contractor relationship. They control the terms and conditions of their engagement. They generally provide their own tools or equipment. They generally cover most of their own expenses, except for extraordinary business-related travel. That's an independent contractor relationship, and it's probably going to be recognized as such in just about every state. But I say just about because you have to look at compliance at two levels. One is the federal law on classification of workers, which is going to be uniform across the states. But then you also have to look at it on a state-by-state basis. Each state has developed some nuances around how they define independent contractors for various analyses. It may be different for determining whether an employer is going to be held liable for the actions of the worker. It may be a different test for workers' compensation claims. It may be a different test for unemployment eligibility. So there's a variety of tests even within a state, and some are becoming much more draconian. So in California, the leading state where everything goes a little bit awry for employers, there is something called the ABC test. It was actually adopted as a matter of legislative action through AB 5, where if you are not doing something that is separate and apart from the nature of the business, then you're deemed to be more likely than not an employee. And it's an extraordinarily high burden to try to overcome. So if you're an accounting firm and you bring in somebody to do some accounting work for you, they may be new to the business, but they're doing work that's fundamental to the business. In California, that's going to be presumptively an employee. So in order to make sure that you're compliant where you're hiring, make sure that you understand the laws of the local jurisdiction. And if you're a business that is a multi-state employer, you've got locations across the country, don't assume that what flies in one state is going to fly in another. So you want to make sure that whenever you have an arrangement being set up, particularly if it's going to be a longer term or more expensive relationship, just a higher wage earning individual, that you consult with local employment counsel in that jurisdiction to see if there's anything unique about the way that they determine independent contractor status.
That's very helpful. So what about an independent contractor agreement? Is that something that you suggest or recommend?
I do. They are not by any means a panacea. You can have an independent contractor agreement that says all the right things, but the reality of the relationship, the economic reality, the day-to-day control that's exerted is inconsistent with what's written down on paper. It's always going to be that the situational circumstances are going to control over what's written down. But in understanding what the relationship is, an agreement is very helpful. It helps to ward off any claims later on that a worker says that they are entitled to certain benefits, certain coverage for injuries or accidents. It clarifies the party's understanding about right to control, hours of employment or hours of engagement, the fee that's going to be arranged, whether they're eligible for overtime. So that helps with misunderstandings. There's also some states where there's a rebuttable presumption of independence where you do have a compliant agreement. For example, Arizona, where I'm based, has a statute called the Doing Independent Business Statute. And if you have the right elements as set forth in the statute and the parties actually adhere to what's written down, it becomes the burden shifts then to prove that that relationship was not independent. The employer has a leg up in the process. So it always helps. And in some jurisdictions, it can be extraordinarily helpful evidence.
Maybe this would be a good
Preston?
time for me to weigh in a little bit on the employee benefit side. So if assuming you're in Linda mentioned it's a competitive market, there's a lot of things you may do. You may be in the position of trying to sell the company to the CEO you're seeking. Set aside the independent contractor for the moment and assume you're going to hire the person as an employee. Some good employee benefit plans can give you a competitive edge. Now, I don't mean the 401k plan. Most of you probably have a 401k plan. That's a tax qualified, traditional retirement plan where a person can defer $22,500 a year, maybe an additional $6,500. That's not a lot of money for maybe a very highly paid executive. It's good. They will want to join that plan, but that won't give you the edge because most companies have 401ks, for example. Even a traditional defined benefit plan, there's a lot of restrictions over what the executive would get. They would pretty much be as a participant like every other employee. So what do? Well, in the area of executive compensation, what we call non-qualified deferred compensation, there are ways you can give just the executives and even perhaps just a CEO a way to get more money set aside for their. You think of it as set aside for retirement. What it is really, it's set aside until they get ready to leave, or maybe after a period of years. So in other words, it defers the tax. It does two things. They can defer a lot more money than they can under the 401k plan. And they can also put off the taxation for several years. So there's kind of three basic ways I like to think about executive compensation, three separate purposes. One is to allow the executive to defer significantly more money than the rest of the employees can defer under say a 401k. We call those kinds of plans, they go by a lot of different names. One of them is called a top hat plan. The other, if you do have a traditional defined benefit plan, there's limits on how much of a benefit can be paid out. So there's even an executive compensation plan you're allowed to give them. It's called an excess benefit plan, and like the name implies, it allows you to provide the executive with a benefit in excess of the maximum benefit they would otherwise be allowed. So if you just want to allow the employee to set aside more money, that would be attractive program number one. Number two would be to offer performance-related additional compensation that's performance-related. It could be bonuses, which you're probably well aware of, tied to performance metrics that would be based on whatever your company thinks is the important performance metric. But it could also be, you can do both. You can have the bonus. You can also allow them to defer the bonus, defer the taxation on the bonus if they don't receive it right away and they receive it in the future. And then third category, the bucket I like to think of are those kinds of plans where you want to align the interest of the CEO with the interest of the company. And probably the classic way to do that is to give the CEO some form of stock-based compensation. So if the stock price goes up because they're doing a good job, their compensation goes up. Stock option plans are classic in this regard. Now, but there's one I wanted to focus on the most for you all in the audience today. If I'm right, family-owned businesses, it's the family that owns the stock. You don't want to have an outsider, even a CEO, become a stockholder. You can still do this. You have what are known as, generally referred to as phantom stock plans. You grant them phantom units, and the value of that unit is equal to the price of the stock when you grant it. And if the price of the stock goes up, the value of the phantom unit goes up. And then, but then what you will pay them is cash when the time comes, instead of letting them have, buy stock. So you keep the stock closely held, but you can align the interest of the CEO with the company if you want to do that, so that when the stock value goes up, their compensation goes up. Those I would consider the three basic buckets. There are rules around executive compensation. They're a lot less rigorous than they are around classic pension plans, but there are some rules starting about 20 years ago, strict rules about once you've set up one of these plans, you can't really toy with it. You can't toy with or change the dates, the timing of the deferrals and the timings of the distributions. But the rules do not prevent the employer and the executive from allowing the executive to defer a lot more money than under the traditional plans. So those were things that might give you a competitive edge at the negotiation stage. They also might give you the ability to use those plans to retain someone if you want them to stay around for a while. Maybe make the benefits subject to say a 5-year vesting schedule is classic if you want to keep them around for a period of time. So those are some of the things you might want to think about if you're trying to get an edge up on some other people you might be competing with to get an executive.
Well, thank you, Preston. You actually answered the question I was going to ask you, so I appreciate that. I'm going to switch back to Laura now because I want to talk about non-competes. The very, very important family businesses are talking about it now because there is potential legislation that would eliminate non-competes. So could you tell us, Laura, what is the current law around non-compete agreements?
Well, currently, as we sit here right now on July 26th, non-competes are still valid in just about every state in the country if they are properly tailored. The exceptions, the big one being California. There's a handful of other states, North Dakota, Washington, D.C., and Oklahoma, that are also hostile towards non-competes, but the vast majority of states will recognize them. Where the concern is coming from is that on a variety of fronts, federal administrative agencies have been attacking restrictive covenants of late. And a lot of that is reflective of the current pro-employee, pro-labor administration that we have, and that the agencies are naturally following the footsteps of that, finding that restrictive covenants have a tendency to chill employee concerted activity. So that's why the National Labor Relations Board is concerned, and chill competition, which is where the Federal Trade Commission is concerned about these. Both agencies have declared war effectively, but those are declarations of administrative policy and intent. At this point, there is no regulatory guidance that prohibits the implementation of non-competes, but they certainly do raise the specter that there could be rulemaking in the next year to 2 years that could invalidate some of these agreements, at least prospectively. And so it's a good time for employers who have been relying on these types of agreements to start looking at it with a more refined eye, a more critical eye, to see if there's other ways that they can encourage and incentivize retention. Some of the reasons that Preston just offered 5-year vesting schedules that encourage retention as opposed to just a prohibition on going to a competitor. The cultural issues that Linda alluded to are also going to be increasingly important. How do you make someone want to stay as opposed to feeling that they have to stay because they're tethered and can't go to a competitor? If these become increasingly subject to legislative action and attacked judicially as well, then we're going to have to rely more on the carrot as opposed to the stick approach to incentivizing good behavior by executives.
So some of our family businesses are concerned that without non-competes, some of their employees are going to take their chemical secrets or their engineering secrets that they've developed and go to their competition. And so what advice, you gave us some advice about that, but in the event that non-competes are eliminated in the state that they live in, can you offer some advice?
Well, first, let's make sure we define what non-compete is, because I think it's a term that's thrown around quite casually, and it actually is narrower than most people use it. And non-compete truly means that for a period of time after your employment relationship with your current employer ends, you will not accept employment with a business or person who competes directly with the nature of the business. And it's typically tailored in time. So up to a year is about the norm. Beyond that gets a little bit excessive, and within a geographic range. And that can either be a specific radius, a mileage or kilometer radius from where you're working, or for specific individual competitors, regardless of where they're located. And how broad that geographic territory is going to be permissible is going to depend largely on where you engaged in services on behalf of the employer, where you obtained confidential information or had customer relationships. So you can't simply say, after you work for ABC Corp, you can't work for any company that competes with ABC Corp for the next 25 years anywhere on planet Earth. There's no court anywhere, even in jurisdictions that aren't hostile, that would allow that, because it means that somebody is effectively out of work and unable to provide for themselves and their family indefinitely. But a non-compete is different than a customer non-solicitation provision, which are generally looked at with a little less skepticism. That says you can go work for a competitor. You can use the knowledge, skills, and education that you have, but you cannot, for a period of time after employment, target specific customers that are important to us. So if we have our 10 key customers and you've developed these very unique relationships, you have the goodwill of the company, you have the inside knowledge of what that customer needs because you've actually learned it on our time and on our dime, you're going to stay hands-off for a while. That still allows you to engage in your business and provide for your family, but you have to show a little bit more ingenuity in finding a new source of clients. Those are under less attack. And even in states where there's a hostility towards non-competes, there's a little bit more understanding and acceptance of non-solicits. There's no state currently that prohibits the use of non-disclosure agreements. That's where you're allowed to go ahead and compete with your competitor. You may even be allowed to solicit customers or referral sources, vendors, suppliers, and employees that you have relationships with. But you can't, in the process of doing that, disclose information that's confidential to you. So it was provided to you on a need-to-know basis with all of the indicia of confidentiality. You can't, for example, go to the customer and say, I know that you have a percentage profit margin over at my prior employer of X. I can undercut that by 2% and get you a better deal, because now you're using insider information that you would only have had access to by virtue of that prior relationship. Those are still intact everywhere. There's no indication at this point that even agencies like the FTC that are looking critically at non-competes are going to invalidate bona fide non-disclosure agreements. So if you don't have those in place now, at a minimum, we should be adopting those and making sure that our definition of confidential information is actually related to confidential information and not an end run around a non-compete. Beyond that, you still have the right to protect your trade secrets, and that's a matter of statutory protection. Every state has its own version of the Uniform Trade Secrets Act or some modification of it. So those truly, truly top secret informations in your example, Pat, the top chemical formula, the formula to Coca-Cola, or the secret sauce in the McDonald's Big Mac meal. Those are trade secrets. That's going to be protected by statute under state law. There's also a federal law called the Defend Trade Secrets Act that applies, and it's very similar in form and remedies available to the state laws. So don't fear that you're going to be letting go of all of your intellectual property and all of your invention rights This is just going to be another hurdle in how to keep employees from going to your direct competitors, but all of these other tools should be utilized now, so that we prepare for that. Hopefully not going to be coming in the near future, but in case it is, we'll be prepared for it.
Okay, well, that's helpful, very helpful. So I'm going to switch back to Linda now and talk about what family businesses always like to talk about, and that is next gen. So let's talk about the next generation of family business and family office leaders. There's a lot of challenges with finding the next gen, developing the next gen, raising the ranks of that next gen through family-owned businesses, and some of the family business centers are helping in that way. But a lot of people are calling this the new age in recruiting with next gen. And so, Linda, what are your thoughts on that?
I would say, I don't think it's a new age. I think it's rather a shift to becoming much more strategic and proactive around the whole identifying and developing the future leaders. I think that those who are successfully, again, a best practice is borrowing from business, high potential programs and strategic planning programs. It's strategically on an ongoing basis, identifying what are your future needs as a business or a family office, family business. What are the leadership requirements? Not only skill and experience requirements, but what are the personal characteristics and attributes needed to be successful in the future? And then identifying and developing future leaders, looking internally within the family business or the family office, looking at providing internships if it's family members starting at young ages. If people are already in the business, looking at training and development and mentoring kinds of programs to bring them along. So I think that a lot can be borrowed, strategic, people being strategic and very thoughtful and very proactive, I think is really important. You don't want to get caught on a reactive mode. The further you plan ahead, the more strategic you are, and the better you can develop these training and development and mentoring programs to get the future leaders ready to assume those positions in the future, the more successful you'll be.
Well, but what about bringing in those next gen leaders? Every family office, family business does this a little differently, but there's always the question around, does there have to be rules associated with, are you going to work in the business? Some family businesses, you just have to be a family member to work in the business. Other family businesses, as you know, have a policy around how you work in the family business. And I've seen it all over the map. So what are your thoughts around that?
I'd say I boil it down to maybe three things that I think are really, in my experience, considered best practices and this is family offices as well as family businesses. Number one, I am a big believer in the family employment policy. Before one, every family should have it. What we see most often is a 5-year kind of policy that the individual who is a family member who may want to come into the family business, the family has an employment policy that says they need to work outside for 5 years for an unaffiliated company before they come into the family business. A second thing there is they've got to qualify for the position and meet the qualifications and go through an interview process just like anyone else would. And that's both for internal as well as that's for a lot of reasons. And I'll tell a story in a minute that kind of amplifies that. But they've also got to be not only qualified to take the position, but they got to be held accountable for the same performance standards and metrics of success that anyone else would be. So it really is basically being on market, just like anyone else would be. They've got to qualify for the job. They've got to fulfill the performance expectations for the position. And I think here, as we talked before, identifying family members who may be good prospects for the family business and working with them to train, mentor, and bring them along so that they are ready when the time comes can be very important for a family. We've seen too many sad stories when a young family member gets put in a position they're not qualified for, or they can't perform well in, and then it becomes a very awkward, if not horribly difficult situation. Third thing is, and people always ask, compensation. I believe that family member or non-family member, they should be compensated according to market for that position. And I think that across the board. Some people say family members shouldn't make as much money because it's their responsibility as a family member. I'm a believer that you're not only qualify on the same basis as any non-family member, but you also are compensated according to what market is for that position. Couple of quick stories just to kind of amplify a few of these things. One was kind of the classic story of a family who put one of their young family members into a position, and unfortunately the person did not perform well. It was partially a question of qualifications to be able to do the job, but it was also just not performing up to expectations. So the father had to make a very tough decision to, after a lot of counseling, to terminate his son. So when the son walked in, the father had his boss hat on, and he said, I'm very sorry to tell you. And he went through what he hadn't been doing in terms of meeting expectations and fired him. And then he took off that hat and he put on the father hat and he said, son, I understand you've just lost your job. I'm so sorry to hear that. How can I be helpful to you? But the point is, they've got to treat the situation like they would with any other employee in terms of holding them accountable. The second one is a fun compensation example. This is a family that had a family business. The principal wanted his son to come into the business, but again, had them go work 5 years someplace else first. The son was very high performer, did very, very well, was working for an investment banking firm, very successful. And now it came time for the father to want him to come back in the business. The problem was the son was making a lot more money than what the position in the family business could pay or should pay based on what was market for that position and internal equity and a lot of other issues. So the father had to make a really tough decision. He really wanted the son to come in the business, but does he pay him more or does he pay him what the market rate for the position is? The father said he wound up making the decision that the only decision he felt was appropriate was to offer him the job based on what the market position for the position was. The son turned down the job and stayed in investment banking, but the father said he had to do it. The only way he would maintain his credibility and the credibility of the other senior executives in the firm was if he made the decision that way. So the son wound up coming into a governance role on the board, but not in a working relationship in the company. But there are tough decisions to be made. But it's an overall it's success of the family business that at the end of the day is going to best serve the family as well. And maybe there are other ways to be able to bring a family member into the business rather than in the traditional. In a position if they're either not qualified to perform that position or there's compensation or other issues like that.
Well, you brought up compensation of family members in the family business or the family office. So let's talk about that. That's always a huge issue, right? Mm-hmm. And Laura and Preston, you can comment after Linda does if you'd like to. So how do you fairly compensate family members? We all know that everyone looks at them differently. Family members always look at family members as the mother, father, sister, brother, aunt, uncle. They never see them as the professional first. So you have to get past that hurdle. And then sometimes the family member feels like they should be overly compensated because they are a family member. And then you have the employee's attitude about them because the employees feel like, well, they're probably being compensated more just because they are a family member. So they have to earn the respect and the confidence of the employees themselves. So it's really a fine dance, but compensation is very, very important. So what is your advice to families on how do you properly compensate a family member working in the family business or the family office?
As I mentioned before, I think the way that you keep the respect and credibility of all of your other employees and so forth is that you have a culture that says if a person is going to assume a job, they're qualified to just like anyone else to assume that job. They're held to the same performance standards that anyone else would be held to, and they're compensated according to market for that position, and bonuses and so forth are based on performance. I think that, we've had a couple of situations that we've run into more with family office, but it could be family business as well, where the family member was not compensated at all. And they were going to step aside And now they wanted to hire the first professional into the position, and they, about fell over when they found out what the market compensation rate would be. So, it's I think it's a return on investment, and I think it's the most prudent, I think, and appropriate way to approach it, and the most defensible way to approach it. And I don't mean defensible from a legal standpoint. I mean it really from a credibility standpoint, and being able to attract and retain the best and the brightest for your family business is to just be, consistent across the board. Whoever winds up being promoted into a position is qualified for it. Now, you can coach. It doesn't say you can't coach and develop them. And that's where I think, particularly with family members, if you are going to want them in the business longer term, you start that coaching and development early, and maybe there's internships or there's other ways to handle it. But I think if you're consistent in your practice, that people who assume positions of leadership or whatnot in a family business or office are qualified, number one. They're held to the performance standards and expectations anyone else would be, and they're compensated according to what market is for that position and for their performance. If their bonuses and other things, then I think that's the best way to operate, and I think that's the best practice out there that we've seen.
Well, so Laura, do you have any comments on that? Preston?
Sorry, I was just going to say, in terms of treating everybody the same, and in the area of retirement benefits, so for example, let's take the 401k plan example. It's a little bit simple. The federal law already requires that everybody that participates in the plan participates on the same basis. You can't have a faster vesting schedule for a family member than for another employee. You can't have a earlier participation date or a higher matching contribution. So if it's sort of that shouldn't be on the shoulders of anybody to have to make a decision. Gee, do we treat the family member better or not as well? They're gonna have to be treated the same as every other employee.
Good point.
The wage front, the only thing I would add from an employment defense standpoint is the developing wrinkle is in pay transparency. One of the things that differentiated family office, family businesses from publicly traded companies historically is that you did not have to publish information about the salaries of your highest paid executives and C-suite members, the way publicly traded companies had to. And you don't have to publish existing salary data, but in a number of states, and this is growing, and now municipalities are jumping on this bandwagon as well, you have to start publishing salary bands or salary data in your job postings. So if you have a family member holding a position and there's another identical position for which you're recruiting, now that pay salary data that's going to go in your advertisement may look quite skewed because you have to include the data for the higher paid family member if you're providing some sort of preferential treatment to a family member on the compensation side. So if you have, a job that ordinarily would be posted at $100,000 a year, but because of some family connections, that individual is earning $500,000, then when you post for the second position, the dual position, you now have salary range up to $500,000, and assume that that person who is applying for the position is going to want the higher end of the salary band. And it is not a very satisfying conversation to say, well, that's only in our salary data band because it happens to be my nephew, it happens to be my son or daughter. It's not a great tone to set in an interview for an incoming candidate. And not every state requires that information just yet, but in California is always at the leader of these things. New York City, there's a handful of other states as well that are requiring this information. And typically jobs now are posted on places like LinkedIn and Indeed. So you have a broad national audience. That means that you need to comply with pay transparency requirements in those areas. So I don't see it as an issue where you might have, for example, an Equal Pay Act claim, because very rarely at this level are you going to have two people doing precisely the same job where they would need to be paid precisely the same rate of pay or total salary. But if you're going to have skewed data that could affect your pay transparency for recruiting purposes, it could also change the way that you're reporting if you're large enough to have EEO-1 reporting obligations, assuming that they bring in salary bands. So I think the general trend right now is moving towards more awareness and openness about what individuals are being paid, even in closely held and family businesses.
That's very interesting. So taking off from that, I'm going to ask one of the questions that was again put in the registration by one of the attendees. So how are key requirements and characteristics for leaders of the future evolving? And I would assume that, part of that question alludes to the fact that we've changed in how leaders are evolving because of the pandemic and, other economic and political situations, environments that we live in. So, so Linda, I guess I'll start with you. You have some thoughts on that.
I'd say certainly we call it the family office of the future. I think you could probably just as easily call it the family business of the future. But what are some of the things changing? And I would say that certainly what we see is an emphasis on people being much more strategic and proactive rather than reactive, being proactive, thinking out to the future, thinking around the corners. They're looking for leaders who are much more proactive and strategic. In our experience, also looking for leaders who have not only the business, financial, and investment acumen needed for the position, but also high EQ combined with high IQ. And the EQ is becoming increasingly important. People who are empathetic, people who are approachable, people who are, can really be sensitive to employees, to family, if it's a family office, to employees, if it's a family business, what have you. But that's a very important skill, particularly in a hybrid environment. In the family office, it's someone who is an expert generalist. We talk about that as somebody who is knowledgeable across the whole horizontal spectrum of wealth management, functional disciplines, finance, accounting, tax, estate planning, and so forth. And more importantly, they understand the interconnections between all of them. They have the peripheral vision to know that when something happens 180 degrees to the right, what are the three things 180 degrees to the left that are going to be affected? So they're always thinking that way. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Someone who's an inspiring leader. We've talked about people have a choice in coming to work or not, that you have to, you want them to feel that they belong and they choose to be part of your culture. So creating a culture and being an inspirational rather than the old-fashioned hierarchical leader, I think very, very important. Fostering that culture that will invite, attract, and retain people, make them feel like they belong, make them feel like they want to be there. Technology has become increasingly important. Every day you hear about artificial intelligence, but I think just basic technology. How can you make things more efficient, more effective? How can you use systems and technology to be able to help you leverage that? For families, we see very important for the future is generational transitions and succession planning. Really need to be smooth, really need to be thoughtful, or you're not going to be able to attract and retain anyone else. And that goes for governance as well, that governance practices are professional and it's not like there are 5 people there in a governance board and except the family member makes the decisions at the dinner table. Again, if you're going to attract and retain the best and the brightest professionally in a family office or family business, governance needs to be sound. And then, we see people who they're looking for leaders who are well networked in the market, and leaders who are continuous learners and really aspire to continuing to know what's going on out there. What are best practices? How can they be better? And so forth.
And Laura, I'm going to ask you this question because we have time and because there are no questions in the Q&A or the chat. And I think it's a really important area that maybe we didn't think we'd have time to cover, but I think we do. And that is about what we've just all talked about, culture and how the culture has changed with more people working remotely and other things. With more and more businesses utilizing this work home options, where is it not uncommon for employees to email documents to their personal email addresses for printing and other simple activities, similar activities? How can employers ensure that confidential information remains protected? We're going through that right now at our organizations because all of us work from home, all of us work remotely. We're trying to make sure that all of our emails are protected. We're all doing the right things, but I'd love to hear your advice.
Yeah, this has been one of the stickiest issues that came out of the pandemic. It didn't start there, but I think it certainly put a finer point on it for employers. If you don't already use VPN connections to access servers and email remotely, that's got to be step one. It's so easy to have data hacking, data theft, data interruption, that there's there's actually now a standard of care for employers. It's hard for you to make the case that your information is confidential, especially if you're going to argue it's a trade secret, if you haven't employed these most basic techniques to ensure that your data is encrypted and traveling through VPN protected networks. There should be a very clear and unambiguous company policy in your handbooks or distributed separately as a memorandum to employees and refreshed regularly that under no circumstances should information ever go to a personal cloud server or personal email address. It's so easy to say, you know, I just want to work on this document at home, so I'm going to send it to my Gmail account and get it there, and then I'll immediately delete it. That is absolutely prohibitable. It should be prohibited because it's too easy for that information to then be intercepted by somebody who hacks your personal account. It's very easy for that information to be then saved onto multiple devices. And if that individual goes rogue or works for a competitor, they still have the trace data on their accounts, and it's very hard to retrieve that information. And part of your IT monitoring should be looking for large volumes of data that are being saved to external media. So if you have something that's being transmitted to a cloud account or to a thumb drive, to a CD-ROM, anyone who's sending large volumes of information or frequent messages to certain extensions like email.com, gmail.com, hotmail.com, outlook.com, that should raise some red flags that cause some more digging. And a lot of this is software that exists and is very, very cost effective. And it works in the background. So it would just raise red flags for IT to be aware if there's any kind of suspicious activity. Also, of course, make sure that you're beefing up your detection of malware and Trojan horse type information, because the most dangerous thing that can happen is that somebody hacks your account, holds your server or hostage, and this happens, and says if you want anyone in your family, in your business to have access to the servers and be able to do anything, then you need to pay this literal ransom to me within a certain number of hours or minutes, or I'm going to delete all the data in your servers. That's the lifeblood of most organizations these days. It's not widgets, it's data bytes. So all of these are now considered, you know, not only best practices, but I think basic standard of care to avoid claims of negligence on the part of employers. And employees should go through regular training. It should be part of your annual compliance and regulatory training, the same way that you do refreshers on harassment and on time recording and all of that other good stuff. Related to that, but separate, is now that you have so many people working in a remote environment where they're not under your watchful eye, they also need some additional training on what they should and shouldn't be doing from home while they're working. You know, having one job at a time is still something that employers can expect. And I have far too many cases right now where we're getting the cross-wired emails from one job to another, and all of a sudden we detect that an employee working from home actually has two simultaneous employers, and they're doing about 3 to 4 hours a day for each and phoning it in the rest of the time and making double income. How to be safe while they're working remotely, and also how they can request and be reimbursed for business expenses. California, again, I keep coming back to this land where there's a million landmines for employers, but there's a case law in California that even a portion of your electric and home Wi-Fi bill has to be apportioned to the time that's dedicated to work. So if somebody is using their Wi-Fi connection, their telephone connection, their smartphone data to do work, that has to be reimbursed by the employer. And that's true in a number of jurisdictions as well. So not only making sure they're safe with your information and keeping it protected, but that you're complying with all of these additional requirements around remote workers.
I could add a personal story as a former government regulator in the retirement plan space, but also federal agency. I was an agency head. This whole general topic of cybersecurity is so important to organizations of all levels, and this may or may not be of interest. I think it'll be of interest to family-owned businesses. We went so far, and the government goes so far as to hire experts to actually come and try to hack your system. It's called a penetration test, a pen test for short. And once they've done that, then they come and they give you your list. They say, hey, we got in here, we got in there, here's what we could do. You got to fit. And then the beauty of that is they give you, then you have a long printout of things you have to fix. And you do that, you may not want to do that all that often, and you may not be able to afford to do it at all. I'm not sure about the size of your organization, but if you really want to know, whether you're vulnerable, hire your own person to attack you, and that'll give you a laundry list of how to fix your shortcomings.
And we've seen a number of really like accounting firms starting to provide that kind of service, that they will do the penetration, so that because as we see with a lot of people, we always ask families, what is your social media policy? What is your, the various policies like that? Because they're exposing themselves, as we say, they're locking the front door, but they're leaving all the windows open, and the kids are out on social media, and there's a lot of different ways to access them. And in this day of it's cybersecurity, but it's also kidnap, ransom, and a lot of other horrible things. So I think that's very important. And we're seeing more and more providers, as I say, accounting firms among them, really getting involved in trying to provide this to families and trying to impress upon them how important it is to protect themselves.
I'm glad you mentioned the accounting firms. The agency I had led, I had a contracted with a large accounting firm to do pen tests. You're right. So the large accounting firms do it. I'm sure there's a lot of others.
Yeah. And for those who are perhaps not at the size where that's economically feasible or practical, I would say there's some very simple things you can do in the meantime that will help. For one thing, have a standard policy that you will never provide to anyone, no matter whether it's, your direct supervisor all the way up to the CEO, any kind of compilation of employee information in spreadsheet form. Cyber spoofing happens all the time. You get an email account that looks just like the CEO or the CFO's email address, send a message, and unfortunately this has happened to enough of my clients that this is routine. I need a list of all the employees with their social security numbers, date of birth, date of hire, and their titles, because we're doing some business planning reorganization. It's a data hacker. It's just someone who stole the theft, who engaged in data theft, and now you have to do all your incident reporting for a data breach. You have to report to your state government regulators, and sometimes depending on how much personal health information or other information, it has to go to federal regulators. And it's a public relations nightmare. You do have to then provide all the sort of credit monitoring and protection to your employees, and it doesn't go very far for building morale when that happens. And it's something as easy as I thought it was a CEO asking me for a routine report. I was just doing my job, but I didn't notice that there was one letter that was off in the email address because I'm looking at it on my phone or I'm working from home and didn't follow up. So if you have just that policy alone, that you will have a double check before sending any compilation of information with personal information of employees, that will go a long way.
I just had a
Well,
request.
I'm so glad I asked that question. It's really important. Go ahead, Linda.
I was just going to say a funny example is I don't trust anything coming over the internet. So the payroll company wanted certain information from me, and I just keyed back and I said, I don't know whether this is spam or not, but you better call me and prove it to me somehow, because I'm not providing anything to anybody over the internet.
Good for you. Appreciate that. Well, unfortunately, our time is up because this has been really fascinating. I know this was very valuable for everybody on this call and will be valuable for those that are going to view it, because it is being recorded and we usually have a lot of views on our recording. So I want to thank you all so very much for joining us today. I think it was, again, very useful, very beneficial to everyone on the call and myself and particularly. And I just really, again, appreciate your time. Thanks so much to everybody. Have a great day. Take care.